Sarah Martinez never imagined that her decision to join the military would lead to one of the most challenging moments of her life. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she was always the girl who stood up to bullies, who never backed down from a fight, and who believed that respect was something you earned, not something given freely. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength came not from size or aggression, but from determination and skill. When Sarah turned 18, she made the decision that would change everything. Against her mother's worried protests and with her father's proud blessing, she enlisted in the Army. The recruitment office was filled with young men and women, all eager to serve their country. But Sarah noticed she was one of only 3 women in the group that day. The recruiting sergeant, a tough-looking man with graying hair and piercing eyes, looked at her with skepticism. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Military life isn't easy for anyone, but it can be especially challenging for women. Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "I'm sure, sir. I didn't come here looking for easy." The first few weeks of basic training at Fort Benning were exactly what Sarah expected. Grueling, demanding, and designed to push every recruit to their absolute limit. The drill sergeant seemed to take particular pleasure in testing the female recruits, giving them extra attention that wasn't always welcome. Sarah found herself waking up at 4 in the morning for 5-mile runs, spending hours in the mud during obstacle courses, and learning to handle weapons that felt foreign in her hands. Her bunk was in a barracks with 12 other women, and she quickly learned that military life meant very little privacy and even less personal space. The women came from all walks of life, some from military families like herself, others from inner cities looking for a way out, and a few from suburbs who wanted to serve their country. Despite their different backgrounds, they formed a tight bond, supporting each other through the toughest moments of training. One of her fellow recruits was Maria Rodriguez from Los Angeles, whose quick wit and infectious laugh helped everyone get through the hardest days. Another was Jennifer Kim from Seattle, quiet and studious, but incredibly strong both physically and mentally. These women became Sarah's support system, her sisters in arms, and together they faced every challenge that came their way. The male recruits in their company were a mixed group as well. Most were respectful and treated the women as equals, understanding that they were all there for the same reason. They formed study groups together, helped each other with difficult exercises, and created friendships that Sarah knew would last a lifetime. However, there was one recruit who stood out for all the wrong reasons. Private Jake Morrison was a large man from Alabama, standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing at least 220 pounds. From the moment he arrived at basic training, he made it clear that he didn't think women belonged in the military. His comments started small, muttered remarks about women being weak, jokes about how they would never make it through training, and suggestions that they were only there to find husbands among the male soldiers. Sarah initially tried to ignore Morrison's behavior, focusing instead on her training and her goal of becoming a soldier. She excelled in most areas of basic training, scoring high on physical fitness tests, demonstrating excellent marksmanship skills, and showing natural leadership abilities that even the drill sergeants noticed. Her determination to succeed, despite the challenges, only seemed to anger Morrison more. As the weeks passed, Morrison's behavior escalated. He would deliberately bump into female recruits during exercises, make crude comments about their appearance, and question their abilities in front of other soldiers. When the drill sergeants weren't around, he would make it known that he believed women were making the military weaker and that they didn't deserve to wear the same uniform as the men. Sarah's breaking point came during the 6th week of training. The company was practicing hand-to-hand combat techniques, learning basic self-defense moves that might save their lives in combat situations. The drill sergeant was demonstrating proper form and technique, emphasizing that these skills were essential for every soldier, regardless of gender or size. Morrison raised his hand during the demonstration. "Sergeant, what's the point of teaching this stuff to the women? In a real fight, they're just going to get themselves killed anyway." The drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Williams, was a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan and had no patience for discrimination of any kind. His voice was calm but carried a dangerous edge. "Private Morrison, the Army doesn't differentiate between male and female soldiers when it comes to combat skills. Every soldier needs to be able to defend themselves and their fellow soldiers." Morrison persisted, his voice growing louder. But Sergeant, let's be realistic here. Look at Private Martinez there. She might be tough for a girl, but in a real fight against a real enemy, she wouldn't stand a chance. Sarah felt the eyes of every recruit in the company turn toward her. The moment felt suspended in time, and she knew that her response would define not just how Morrison saw her, but how all her fellow soldiers would see her. She could feel her heart racing, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Private Morrison, I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I'm confident in my training and my abilities. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the training ground. Training is one thing, Martinez. Reality is something else entirely. Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward, clearly ready to end the discussion, but Sarah held up her hand. She had been raised to stand up for herself, and she wasn't about to let Morrison's ignorance go unchallenged in front of her peers. If you're so concerned about my abilities, Morrison, maybe we should settle this with a demonstration. The entire company fell silent. Even Staff Sergeant Williams looked surprised by Sarah's boldness. Morrison's face broke into a wide grin, clearly thinking he had just been handed an easy victory. You sure about that, Martinez? I don't want to hurt you in front of everyone. Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised and her shoulders squared. I'm sure, unless, of course, you're afraid that you might be wrong about women soldiers. The challenge was issued, and there was no taking it back. Staff Sergeant Williams looked between the two recruits, clearly weighing his options. This was not a situation covered in any training manual, but he also understood that sometimes leadership meant allowing soldiers to resolve their conflicts in ways that would ultimately strengthen the unit. Word spread quickly through the barracks that night. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone on the base knew about the challenge between Sarah Martinez and Jake Morrison. Some of the female recruits worried that Sarah was making a mistake, that she was putting herself in danger for the sake of pride. Others, like Maria and Jennifer, supported her decision completely, understanding that this was about more than just one confrontation. The male recruits were divided as well. Many of them respected Sarah and believed she could hold her own, while others worried that Morrison's size advantage would be too much to overcome. A few quietly supported Morrison's views, though they were smart enough to keep those opinions to themselves around the drill sergeants. As news of the challenge spread, it reached the ears of more senior personnel on the base. Captain David Thompson, the company commander, was a fair-minded officer who believed strongly in equal opportunity and equal treatment for all soldiers. When he heard about the situation, he made the decision that would set everything in motion. Rather than shut down the challenge or discipline both soldiers, Captain Thompson saw an opportunity for a teaching moment. He decided to allow the confrontation to take place, but under controlled conditions and with proper supervision. More importantly, he decided to make it a demonstration for a much larger audience. The base was preparing for a visit from a group of high-ranking officers and government officials who were touring military training facilities. Captain Thompson realized that this challenge could serve as a powerful demonstration of the capabilities of all soldiers, regardless of gender. He also understood that having witnesses would ensure that whatever happened, the outcome would be clear and undeniable. Sarah spent the week leading up to the demonstration focusing intensely on her training. She worked with the hand-to-hand combat instructors, practiced her techniques repeatedly, and studied Morrison's fighting style during group training sessions. She wasn't just preparing for a fight. She was preparing to prove a point that would echo far beyond this single moment. Morrison, confident in his physical advantages, didn't seem to take the preparation as seriously. He continued his disparaging comments about female soldiers, now with added confidence that he would soon have the opportunity to prove his point in front of everyone. His attitude only strengthened Sarah's resolve. The night before the demonstration, Sarah called her father. She didn't tell him about the specific situation, but she asked him about facing opponents who seemed to have every advantage. "Mija," her father said in his warm, gravelly voice, "size and strength are just two tools in a toolbox. The smartest fighter is usually the one who wins, not the biggest one. Remember everything I taught you about using your opponent's strength against them." As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a calm determination settle over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, or tough enough to succeed in a man's world. The morning of the demonstration arrived with an unseasonably cool breeze that carried the scent of rain across Fort Benning. Sarah woke before her alarm, her mind already sharp and focused, despite having slept only fitfully through the night. Around her, the other women in the barracks were beginning to stir, and she could sense the nervous energy that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Maria Rodriguez was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper in the pre-dawn darkness. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" Sarah sat up in her narrow bunk, running her hands through her short, dark hair. "I feel ready," she said simply, and she meant it. The nervousness she had felt earlier in the week had transformed into something else entirely. A calm, focused determination that surprised even her. As the women prepared for the day, word came down through the chain of command that the demonstration had attracted even more attention than originally planned. What had started as a simple training exercise had evolved into something much larger. Military personnel from across the base would be in attendance, along with the visiting dignitaries. Sarah realized that she wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was representing every woman who had ever put on a military uniform. The mess hall was unusually quiet during breakfast. Conversations were hushed, and Sarah noticed that many of her fellow recruits kept glancing in her direction. Some offered encouraging smiles, others looked worried, and a few seemed skeptical about the entire situation. Morrison sat with his usual group of supporters, and Sarah could hear his loud, confident voice carrying across the room as he predicted an easy victory. Staff Sergeant Williams approached Sarah's table as she was finishing her breakfast. "Private Martinez, I need to speak with you privately." Sarah followed the drill sergeant outside where they could talk without being overheard. Williams was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He had earned the respect of every recruit in the company through his fair treatment and his obvious expertise. "Private, I want you to understand what's happening here today," Williams began, his voice serious but not unkind. "This has grown beyond a simple training exercise. There are going to be a lot of eyes on you, including some very important people who are interested in the role of women in combat positions." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I understand, Sergeant. I also want you to know," Williams continued, "that regardless of what happens today, you've already proven yourself as a soldier. Your performance in training has been exemplary, and your fellow recruits respect you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The demonstration was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning, giving Sarah time to complete her normal training routine. She went through her usual exercises, push-ups, sit-ups, and a 3-mile run, but she could feel the difference in her body. The adrenaline was already beginning to flow, sharpening her senses and making every movement feel more precise. At 9:30, Captain Thompson summoned both Sarah and Morrison to his office. The captain was a tall, distinguished man in his mid-40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His office was sparse but functional, decorated only with military commendations and photos from various deployments. "I want both of you to understand the rules for today's demonstration," Captain Thompson began, looking directly at each recruit in turn. "This is a training exercise, not a street fight. You will demonstrate hand-to-hand combat techniques under the supervision of qualified instructors. The objective is to show proper form and technique, not to injure your opponent." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah suspected that he had been hoping for something less controlled, something that would allow him to use his size advantage more effectively. "Furthermore," the captain continued, "I want both of you to remember that you are representing not just yourselves, but the entire United States Army. Your conduct today will be observed and evaluated by senior military officials. I expect nothing less than your best effort and your most professional behavior." As they left the captain's office, Morrison turned to Sarah with a smirk. "Last chance to back out, Martinez. I wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself in front of all those important people." Sarah looked at him calmly. "I appreciate your concern, Morrison, but I don't embarrass easily." The training ground where the demonstration would take place was located at the center of the base, surrounded by bleacher-style seating that was normally used for graduation ceremonies and other important events. As Sarah arrived, she was surprised to see how many people were already gathering to watch. The bleachers were filling with soldiers, officers, and civilians, and she could see several men and women in expensive suits who were obviously the visiting dignitaries. Among the spectators, Sarah spotted many familiar faces. Her fellow female recruits sat together in one section, their expressions ranging from nervous to excited. Maria gave her a thumbs up, while Jennifer offered an encouraging smile. The male recruits from her company were scattered throughout the crowd, and she was pleased to see that most of them seemed to be rooting for her. The training ground itself was a large flat area covered with protective mats. Medical personnel were standing by, along with the hand-to-hand combat instructors who would be supervising the demonstration. Sarah noticed that Major Patricia Hayes, one of the highest-ranking female officers on the base, was among the officials who would be observing. The Major's presence gave Sarah an additional boost of confidence. She was looking at a woman who had succeeded in the military despite all the obstacles and prejudices she must have faced. As 10 o'clock approached, the crowd grew larger and more diverse. Sarah estimated that there were now over 300 people in attendance, including soldiers from other companies who had heard about the demonstration and wanted to see for themselves. The energy in the crowd was palpable, with conversations buzzing throughout the bleachers. Morrison arrived a few minutes before 10, accompanied by several of his supporters. He had changed into his training uniform and was stretching ostentatiously, clearly trying to intimidate Sarah with displays of his physical strength. He was indeed an impressive physical specimen, tall, muscular, and moving with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. Sarah, by contrast, appeared much smaller and less imposing. At 5'6" inches tall and weighing 130 pounds, she looked almost fragile next to Morrison's bulk. But those who knew her well could see the quiet confidence in her posture and the focused intensity in her dark eyes. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior hand-to-hand combat instructor, called both recruits to the center of the mat. Rodriguez was a compact, powerful man with over 20 years of military experience and expertise in multiple martial arts disciplines. His presence immediately commanded respect from everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez announced to the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the training ground, "today we are going to demonstrate basic hand-to-hand combat techniques as taught in United States Army training. These techniques are designed to be effective regardless of the size or strength of the person using them, emphasizing proper form, timing, and leverage over brute force." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Master Sergeant Rodriguez. His introduction was clearly designed to set the stage for what was about to happen, emphasizing the technical aspects of combat rather than physical advantages. "The demonstration will consist of several scenarios," Rodriguez continued. "Both recruits will have the opportunity to demonstrate offensive and defensive techniques. The objective is to show proper execution of these techniques under controlled conditions." As Rodriguez explained the rules and procedures, Sarah used the time to center herself mentally. She closed her eyes briefly and ran through the techniques she had been practicing, visualizing each movement and feeling the flow of energy through her body. When she opened her eyes, she found Morrison staring at her, with an expression that was part amusement and part annoyance. The first portion of the demonstration involved basic defensive moves, blocks, parries, and evasive techniques. Sarah and Morrison took turns attacking and defending, with Master Sergeant Rodriguez providing commentary on their form and technique. During this phase, both recruits performed adequately, though Sarah's movements were noticeably more fluid and precise. The crowd watched intently as the demonstration progressed. Sarah could hear murmured conversations and occasional comments, but she forced herself to block out the distractions and focus entirely on the task at hand. She was acutely aware that this was more than just a training exercise. It was a test that would have implications far beyond this single moment. As they moved into more advanced techniques, the differences between the two recruits became more apparent. Morrison relied heavily on his strength and size, using brute force to overpower his opponents. His techniques were effective but lacked finesse, and Sarah could see that he was already beginning to tire from the exertion. Sarah, by contrast, moved with economy and precision. She used her opponent's momentum against him, redirecting attacks rather than simply blocking them. Her techniques were textbook perfect, demonstrating exactly what the instructors had been teaching about using leverage and timing to overcome larger opponents. The turning point came during a grappling exercise. Morrison, growing frustrated with Sarah's technical superiority, began to use more force than the exercise required. Master Sergeant Rodriguez warned him once about maintaining control, but Morrison's competitive nature and his need to prove his point were overriding his judgment. During one exchange, Morrison grabbed Sarah's arm with unnecessary force and attempted to throw her to the mat using pure strength rather than proper technique. Sarah felt the pressure on her arm increase beyond what was safe or appropriate for a training exercise, and she realized that Morrison was no longer following the rules. The crowd sensed the change in intensity immediately. The casual conversation stopped, and everyone leaned forward to get a better view of what was happening on the mat. Sarah could hear Maria calling out words of encouragement, and she was dimly aware that Major Hayes was sitting forward in her seat, her expression intense and focused. Morrison's grip on Sarah's arm tightened further, and she could feel him beginning to apply the kind of pressure that could cause serious injury. This was no longer a demonstration of technique, it was becoming something much more dangerous. Morrison was trying to prove his point by overwhelming her with brute force, regardless of the potential consequences. In that moment, Sarah realized that everything she had trained for, everything she believed about herself and about women in the military, was being tested. The crowd of over 300 soldiers and officials was watching to see how she would respond to this challenge. More importantly, she was faced with a choice that would define not just this moment, but her entire military career. The pressure on Sarah's arm was becoming unbearable. Morrison's grip had tightened to the point where she could feel the bones in her forearm grinding together, and she knew that he was seconds away from causing serious damage. The demonstration had moved far beyond the realm of controlled training, and Morrison's face showed a determination that bordered on dangerous. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, clearly recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond acceptable limits. "Private Morrison, release your grip immediately. You are exceeding the parameters of this exercise." But Morrison either didn't hear the instruction or chose to ignore it. His focus was entirely on Sarah, and she could see in his eyes that he was committed to proving his point regardless of the consequences. The crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that something was seriously wrong. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could call out for help, effectively ending the demonstration and admitting that she couldn't handle the situation. She could try to tap out, following standard training protocol for when an exercise became dangerous. Or she could trust in her training and her abilities and find a way to turn Morrison's aggression against him. The pain in her arm was shooting up to her shoulder now, and she could see Morrison's satisfied expression as he believed he was proving his point about women being too weak for military service. Around them, the crowd was beginning to murmur with concern, and several officers were starting to stand, ready to intervene. In that critical moment, Sarah remembered her father's words from their phone conversation the night before. Use your opponent's strength against them. She also recalled countless hours of training, not just from her weeks at Fort Benning, but from years of martial arts classes her father had insisted she take as a child. He had always told her that the strongest fighters were those who could remain calm under pressure and think their way out of difficult situations. Sarah forced herself to relax. Despite the excruciating pain in her arm, she stopped trying to pull away from Morrison's grip and instead shifted her weight slightly, changing the angle of her body in a way that Morrison didn't immediately notice. The movement was subtle, but it aligned her body mechanics in a way that would give her the leverage she needed. Morrison, feeling Sarah's apparent submission, increased his grip even more. He was now applying enough pressure to potentially break her arm, and his face showed the confidence of someone who believed he had won. Several people in the crowd were calling for the exercise to be stopped, but the moment was happening too quickly for effective intervention. Sarah took a deep breath and centered herself. She thought about all the women who had come before her in the military, breaking barriers and proving that courage and skill were not limited by gender. She thought about her fellow female recruits who were watching, whose own futures might be affected by what happened in the next few seconds. She thought about her father, who had raised her to be strong and confident, and who had taught her that backing down from a bully only encouraged more bullying. In one fluid motion, Sarah executed a perfect arm drag technique. Using Morrison's own forward momentum and the force he was applying to her arm, she stepped to the side and pivoted, redirecting his energy in a way that sent him stumbling forward, off balance and overextended. The technique was so smooth and well executed that it looked almost effortless, but the result was devastating to Morrison's position. As Morrison stumbled forward, Sarah immediately followed up with a foot sweep that took his legs out from under him. Morrison, who outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds, found himself falling toward the mat with no way to recover his balance. The crowd gasped as they realized what was happening. But Sarah wasn't finished. As Morrison fell, she maintained control of his arm and followed him down to the mat, transitioning smoothly into a joint lock that left him completely immobilized. In the space of perhaps 3 seconds, she had gone from being a victim of Morrison's aggression to being in complete control of the situation. Morrison hit the mat hard. The wind knocked out of him, and his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made it impossible for him to move without causing himself significant pain. Sarah maintained the hold with perfect technique, applying just enough pressure to keep him controlled without causing injury. The silence that followed was absolute. Over 300 people watched in stunned amazement as the smaller, supposedly weaker recruit had completely neutralized her larger opponent, using nothing but skill, timing, and superior technique. Morrison lay on the mat, gasping for breath and unable to move, while Sarah knelt beside him in perfect control. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to react. "Outstanding technique, Private Martinez. Release the hold." Sarah immediately complied, helping Morrison to his feet with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. Morrison looked dazed and embarrassed, clearly struggling to understand how he had gone from dominant aggressor to helpless victim so quickly. The crowd erupted in applause. The female recruits were cheering loudly, with Maria and Jennifer leading the celebration. But Sarah was surprised to see that many of the male soldiers were applauding just as enthusiastically. She realized that what had impressed them wasn't just that she had beaten Morrison, but how she had done it, with skill, control, and perfect adherence to the principles they had all been taught. Major Hayes stood up in the bleachers, her face showing obvious approval. Captain Thompson was nodding with satisfaction, clearly pleased with how the demonstration had unfolded. Even some of the visiting dignitaries were applauding, recognizing that they had witnessed something exceptional. But the person Sarah was most interested in watching was Morrison himself. As he stood up and straightened his uniform, his face showed a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and something else, what might have been the beginning of respect. The demonstration had not gone at all as he had expected, and Sarah could see him struggling to process what had just happened. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped between the two recruits, addressing the crowd. "What you have just witnessed is a perfect demonstration of the principles we teach in hand-to-hand combat training." Private Martinez executed textbook techniques under pressure, showing that proper form and training can overcome significant physical disadvantages. The instructor then turned to address Sarah and Morrison directly. "Private Martinez, your technique was excellent. You remained calm under pressure, executed your movements with precision, and maintained control throughout the encounter. This is exactly what we want to see from our soldiers." He then looked at Morrison. "Private Morrison, you allowed emotion and personal bias to affect your judgment. In a real combat situation, that kind of loss of control could get you and your fellow soldiers killed. I suggest you spend some time thinking about the lessons from today's demonstration." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by congratulations and praise. Her fellow female recruits rushed down from the bleachers to embrace her, their faces shining with pride and excitement. Maria was practically bouncing with energy. "Sarah, that was incredible. Did you see his face when you flipped him? I thought his eyes were going to pop out of his head." Jennifer, usually the quiet one, was equally enthusiastic. "You showed everyone what we're capable of. I don't think anyone will question women in combat after seeing that." But the reaction that meant the most to Sarah came from some of the male recruits who approached her as the crowd was breaking up. These were soldiers who had been training alongside her for weeks, who had seen her work and dedication, and who had come to respect her as a fellow soldier. "Martinez, that was some of the best technique I've ever seen," said Private Johnson, a quiet young man from Ohio. "You made it look easy." Private Washington, who had been one of Morrison's friends, shook his head in amazement. "I have to admit, I didn't think you could do it. Morrison's been bragging about his fighting skills since day one. You just showed all of us that technique beats strength every time." Even more meaningful was the reaction from some of the drill sergeants and instructors. Staff Sergeant Williams approached Sarah as she was leaving the training ground. "Private Martinez, that was some of the finest hand-to-hand combat I've seen in my 15 years of military service. You kept your composure under pressure, executed perfect technique, and maintained control of the situation throughout. Those are the qualities we look for in our best soldiers." Captain Thompson also made a point of speaking with Sarah before she left. "Private, what you accomplished today goes far beyond winning a demonstration. You've shown that the principles we teach work regardless of gender or physical size. More importantly, you've shown that character and training matter more than physical advantages." As Sarah walked back to the barracks, she reflected on what had just happened. The confrontation with Morrison had been about more than just proving a point about women in the military. It had been about standing up to bullying, about refusing to be intimidated, and about having the courage to face a challenge even when the odds seemed stacked against you. She thought about the other women who would come after her, who would face similar challenges and doubts about their abilities. She hoped that what had happened today would make their path a little easier, that it would serve as proof that women could succeed in any role they were willing to train for and fight for. The aftermath of the demonstration would continue for days and weeks to come. Word of what had happened spread throughout the base and beyond, reaching other military installations and even making it into military publications. Sarah found herself receiving congratulations from soldiers she had never met, and she realized that her actions had resonated far beyond Fort Benning. But perhaps the most surprising development was the change in Morrison's attitude. In the days following the demonstration, he was noticeably quieter and less confrontational. He stopped making disparaging comments about women in the military, and Sarah occasionally caught him watching her during training exercises with what looked like genuine curiosity rather than hostility. The experience had changed something fundamental in the dynamic between the male and female recruits as well. There was a new level of respect and acceptance that hadn't existed before, a recognition that they were all soldiers working toward the same goal, regardless of gender. The weeks following the demonstration brought unexpected changes to life at Fort Benning. Sarah had expected some attention from her performance, but she was surprised by the scope and duration of the impact. Military personnel from other bases were calling to hear details about the incident, and she found herself being used as an example in discussions about women in combat roles. Major Hayes requested a private meeting with Sarah 3 days after the demonstration. The major's office was impressive, with commendations and photos from deployments around the world. As Sarah entered, she was struck by the realization that she was looking at her own potential future, a successful woman who had risen through the ranks despite all obstacles. "Private Martinez, please have a seat," Major Hayes said, her voice warm but professional. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened during the demonstration, and more importantly, about what it means for your future in the military." Sarah sat at attention, unsure what to expect from the conversation. Major Hayes studied her for a moment before continuing. "What you accomplished out there was remarkable, not just from a technical standpoint, but from a leadership perspective. You faced a difficult situation with courage and skill, and you represented the best qualities of a soldier. But I want you to understand that your actions have consequences beyond this base." The major explained that video footage of the demonstration had been shared with military leadership at the highest levels. Pentagon officials were discussing the incident as evidence supporting expanded combat roles for women, and Sarah's performance was being cited in policy discussions she would never have imagined being part of. "With that recognition comes responsibility," Major Hayes continued. "You've become a symbol, whether you intended to or not. Other women in the military will look to you as an example of what's possible. That can be a heavy burden, but it's also an incredible opportunity." Sarah listened carefully, beginning to understand the broader implications of what had happened. She had joined the military to serve her country and to prove herself as a soldier. She hadn't expected to become a symbol or a spokesperson for women's capabilities in combat. "What does this mean for my career, ma'am?" Sarah asked. Major Hayes smiled. "It means you have options that most soldiers don't get. There are people at very high levels who are interested in your development and your future assignments. But it also means you'll be held to a higher standard than most. Everything you do from now on will be watched and evaluated." The conversation with Major Hayes was sobering. but it also filled Sarah with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She realized that her success could open doors for other women, and that failure would not only affect her but could set back opportunities for others. Meanwhile, Morrison was dealing with his own aftermath from the demonstration. The incident had humbled him in ways that Sarah didn't think possible. His loud bragging and confrontational attitude had disappeared, replaced by a quiet focus on his training. Sarah noticed that he was spending extra time in the gym and working with hand-to-hand combat instructors, apparently determined to improve his own skills. The change in Morrison's behavior didn't go unnoticed by the other recruits. Some of his former supporters began to distance themselves from him, while others seemed to gain a new respect for his willingness to learn from the experience. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of feeling sorry for someone who had tried to humiliate and potentially injure her. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the training facility after an extra workout session, she was surprised to find Morrison waiting outside. He looked uncomfortable and uncertain, clearly struggling with something he wanted to say. "Martinez, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his voice lacking the arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions. Sarah stopped, curious about what he might want to discuss. "What's on your mind, Morrison?" Morrison looked down at his boots, then forced himself to meet her eyes. "I wanted to apologize for what happened during the demonstration. I let my personal feelings get in the way of proper training protocol and I put you at risk. That was wrong and I'm sorry." The apology was clearly difficult for him, and Sarah could see that it was genuine. She realized that this was probably the first time Morrison had ever been forced to confront his own limitations and prejudices in such a public and undeniable way. "I appreciate the apology, Morrison," Sarah replied. "What happened out there was a learning experience for all of us." Morrison nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said and did that day. I guess I had some assumptions about women soldiers that weren't based on reality. I was wrong about that." This admission was clearly even more difficult than the apology, and Sarah recognized the courage it took for Morrison to acknowledge his mistake so directly. "We all have assumptions that get challenged sometimes," Sarah said diplomatically. "What matters is how we respond when we learn something new." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other recruits, including Maria and Jennifer. The two groups had learned to coexist peacefully since the demonstration, but there was still some tension when they encountered each other unexpectedly. Morrison nodded to the other women politely, a marked change from his previous behavior. "Ladies," he said simply, then turned back to Sarah. "Martinez, I want you to know that I've requested additional hand-to-hand combat training. Master Sergeant Rodriguez is going to work with me on improving my technique." After Morrison left, Maria looked at Sarah with raised eyebrows. "Did Jake Morrison just apologize to you and ask for training help?" Jennifer added, looking equally surprised. Sarah nodded, still processing the conversation herself. People can change when they're forced to confront their own limitations. The transformation in Morrison became more apparent over the following weeks. He stopped making disparaging comments about women soldiers entirely, and Sarah occasionally noticed him defending female recruits when others made inappropriate remarks. The change wasn't dramatic or performative. It seemed genuine, as if the demonstration had forced him to reevaluate fundamental beliefs he had held for years. As basic training neared its end, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had changed since that morning when she first arrived at Fort Benning. She had come seeking to prove herself as a soldier, but she had accomplished something much larger. The demonstration with Morrison had become a defining moment not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed it. The graduation ceremony was held on the same training ground where the demonstration had taken place. Sarah looked out at the bleachers filled with family members, friends, and military officials and remembered the tension and uncertainty she had felt standing in that same spot weeks earlier. Captain Thompson delivered the graduation address, speaking about the qualities that define a good soldier: courage, dedication, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. As he spoke, Sarah caught his eye several times, and she understood that his words were informed by what he had witnessed during the demonstration. "The soldiers graduating today have shown that they possess these qualities," Captain Thompson said. "They have proven themselves through rigorous training, challenging exercises, and moments that tested their character. They are ready to serve their country with distinction. When Sarah's name was called to receive her certificate, the applause was noticeably louder and longer than for other graduates. She walked across the platform with pride, knowing that she had earned not just the respect of her fellow soldiers, but the recognition that she belonged in the military as much as anyone else. After the ceremony, Sarah's parents were waiting for her, their faces beaming with pride. Her father, the retired Marine, embraced her with tears in his eyes. "Mija, I heard about what happened during your training," he said quietly. "Sometimes I'm proud of how you handled yourself, but I'm even more proud of the woman you've become." Her mother, who had been worried about Sarah's decision to join the military, hugged her tightly. "I was scared when you first enlisted. But seeing you now, I know you made the right choice. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." As the celebration continued around them, Sarah noticed Morrison across the field with his own family. Their eyes met briefly, and he nodded to her with what looked like genuine respect. The gesture was small, but it represented a transformation that went far beyond their personal conflict. Major Hayes approached Sarah as the ceremony was winding down. "Private Martinez, I have some news about your next assignment. Based on your performance here and the recommendations from your instructors, you've been selected for advanced leadership training. It's an opportunity that very few soldiers receive straight out of basic training. The advanced program would prepare Sarah for eventual promotion to non-commissioned officer ranks, putting her on a fast track for leadership positions in the military. It was recognition of her potential and an investment in her future that went far beyond what she had hoped for when she first enlisted. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow female recruits. Maria, Jennifer, and the other women who had trained alongside her had formed bonds that would last throughout their military careers. They had supported each other through the most challenging weeks of their lives, and they had witnessed firsthand how one person's courage could change perceptions and open doors for everyone. "You know what you did for all of us, right?" Jennifer said as they prepared to leave for their various new assignments. "You proved that we belong here, that we can succeed at anything we're willing to work for." Sarah looked around at these women who had become her sisters, understanding that they would all face their own challenges and opportunities in the years ahead. Some would serve in support roles, others would push for combat positions, and all would carry forward the lesson that capability and courage were not determined by gender. As Sarah left Fort Benning for her next assignment, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been part of something larger than herself. The demonstration with Morrison had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would ripple through the military for years to come. Other women would face similar challenges, but they would do so knowing that someone before them had stood up, fought back, and proven that anything was possible with the right preparation and determination. The story of what happened that day became part of military lore, told and retold in training facilities across the country. It became an example used by instructors to demonstrate the importance of technique over strength, of remaining calm under pressure, and of never underestimating an opponent based on their appearance. But for Sarah, it would always be remembered as the moment when she discovered not just her own strength, but her ability to inspire and lead others. It was the moment when she transformed from someone seeking acceptance to someone who could help others find their own path to success.